Social Inclusion Commissioner Professor David Adams finishes up later this year after the government decided to scrap the post to save money. Appointed by the government 3 years ago to help the state's most disadvantaged, Professor Adams will be leaving as more and more Tasmanians grapple with rising costs of living. I spoke to him a short time ago. David Adams, thanks very much for joining us. Your job is likely to be axed later this year, just when massive price hikes are hitting Tasmanian householders. Is that frustrating?
Some of it's frustrating early. However, the government has moved on a number of recommendations in my reports, recommendations around increasing the emergency relief pool for Tasmanians, some recommendations around energy efficiency, the creation of a parliamentary secretary and a parliamentary committee. But yes, I am frustrated that it's unclear to me and to many Tasmanians just who's going to take responsibility for the cumulative impact of price rises, particularly on vulnerable Tasmanian households. I mean,
you mentioned the government has moved on some things, but I mean, part of your job was to develop a cost of living strategy for the government, and you delivered that to them last year. I mean, how and when do you expect them to respond in full?
I would anticipate that in addition to the initial responses, both in the forthcoming budget and then over the next 12 months, there would be a full response to all 13 strategies.
Or you hope?
I would hope so. I'd also hope that the Liberal Party and the Greens would respond as well, and I would expect, as many Tasmanians would, that by March 2014 all three parties would have pretty clear action plans around cost of living.
Now, we're told of good reason for price rises at a business level, such as, the economic regulator explaining, water and sewerage, electricity and so on and so forth. With your position going, who in government, therefore, I mean, you mentioned, you sort of touched on this earlier on, who's going to actually be looking out on the impacts on Tasmanian consumers?
I would expect that one option would be the role of the parliamentary secretary. Secondly, I would certainly promote, as I had recommended in a number of my reports, that alongside the economic regulator, the opportunity is there to have someone focusing on the social risk. In Tasmania we have good legislation.
So take it out of the political sphere and create an independent sort of appointment to Parliament?
Yes, in principle I think this is a broad issue. It would be much better for the Parliament to have the oversight rather than the government of the day.
What are you hearing about, with these massive price hikes about to hit? I mean, we've already had significant increases in many spheres, particularly electricity, and now we're about to head into winter. What are you hearing about the demand for emergency relief?
It's going up significantly. Some of the figures are startling. So in some areas an increase of over 700% in presentations, and it's across all of Tasmania, not just in the cities, across all the rural areas.
700%? What does that translate to in numbers?
For example, up to 22,000 families a year, households a year, presenting for emergency relief.
Is that a new cohort?
Yes, in addition to the traditional cohort, one of the concerns is that we're seeing more of what would be called normally the working poor or the middle class, no longer able to cope and tipping over into the emergency relief systems.
What are the flow-on effects from that? I mean, what gives in those families?
So two or three things give. Firstly, people often ration or substitute. So with electricity they cut back, but in cutting back it might mean, for example, buying takeaway food more often rather than cooking, and that can have a flow-on effect to health status. So generally what you see is increased levels of stress, lower levels of health status. It can affect education. People can't always afford to take their children to school as regularly, don't go to the dentist as regularly. So we see a series of long-term flow-on effects.
Water is seen as an essential of life, and pretty much most people until recently thought it was largely free. What could potentially people end up having their water disconnected if they're unable to pay a bill?
In principle, that's a possibility. As with all essential services, such as accommodation, telecommunications, and with energy, there is a risk at the end of the day, if you don't pay, that you could be disconnected or evicted. And again, it's unlikely to happen. There are lots of hardship and other provisions in place to prevent that. But that's right. In principle, there is a possibility of water disconnection. And the point that I keep making is who's making sure that all of these future risks are mitigated as early as possible, not when the first disconnection occurs.
What would you say that you have achieved in your time?
Two or three things. Firstly, Tasmania is the first state now to have a social inclusion strategy, a cost of living strategy and a food security strategy. We now know where the risks are, we know where the opportunities are, and we should be able as a state to get ahead of all other jurisdictions. Secondly, we do know a lot more about where the social exclusion risks are. We do know a lot more now about the importance of shifting our focus away from problems and risks of families to their assets and their capabilities.
But critically, part of that you see is that your position, whether that be as Social Inclusion Commissioner or some other moniker, that you should be more independent, not reporting to the Premier of the day, but in fact to the Parliament.
I think it's such a broad issue that it's best reporting to the Parliament and ought not be about the individual, but the importance of the issue and the role.
Have you had any response from the government on this?
I expect the government will be working over the next few months with me to look at how to mainstream these issues. Certainly my view is, as I've said in my reports, that the issue of cost of living in particular is so important that it warrants parliamentary focus. There is a parliamentary committee. I would hope that through that committee its importance and new administrative arrangements would be put in place.
David Adams, we're out of time. Thank you.
Thank you.